From the days of the one-room schoolhouse, young men and women entering education have cherished an idealized picture of their profession. Embracing lofty goals and aspirations, they are dedicated to helping their children experience the joy of learning.
Nice expressions.
When you're young and totally committed to educating your students, it is hard to imagine a better way to make a living. But until only recently, the drawbacks associated with working in public education have been enormous.
There was a man teaching next to me in the room adjacent to mine who was receiving more money than I was. And we had the same assignments, the same responsibility for both classes and extracurricular activities. He was receiving more money because he was a man.
It was an absolute necessity to have a job in the summer to make ends meet. And so, yes, I drove a truck for Coca-Cola. I loaded trucks for Coca-Cola.
We should have some input into curriculum. This is what we ought to get in terms of a raise and things like this. Well, you took that, hat in hand, to the school board and the superintendent, and they summarily, out of hand, rejected it and told you what you were going to get, and that was the end of it.
And I wanted to teach biology at the high school. I later found that there was a vacancy there, but I was too physically black. Had I been a mulatto, my opportunity to be considered for a teaching position would have been different.
Today's professionals reap the benefits of the MEA's struggle for basic rights and security that has lasted almost since its beginning in 1852 as the Michigan State Teachers Association. It is only in recent decades that the dedication and idealism commonly associated with educational work has received adequate recognition and compensation. It was the mid-1960s before MEA members finally won tenure rights and the right to bargain collectively.
People who used to live a life of intimidation now lived a life of participation. I think a lot of that happened with teachers in terms of their perception of who they are and how they relate to their work, their students, and their employers. They had security. They had the ability to speak with security. They were no longer poor and isolated from the economic mainstream of their communities. They're not wealthy and they never will be. It's the nature of their work in public politics and taxes. But they made a decent living and they could live with some dignity.
My country, 'tis of me, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride.
In the early years of the 19th century, when Michigan was on the northwest frontier, educating the young was a haphazard enterprise, with decisions made locally, based on perceived local needs and interests. And most teachers were men, until Civil War battlefield needs put women into the classroom. Veterans of the Civil War chose, for the most part, not to go back into the classroom and do women's work.
Most of the teachers in this period after the Civil War and on into the early 20th century were young women who taught 2 to 4 years with great pride. As you read their memoirs and their letters to their friends, their diaries and their journals, they identify themselves even years later as I am a teacher. But what incredible optimism to go into a one-room school with maybe anywhere from 5 to 25 or 35 children, ranging in age from 4 to maybe 20 years old, maybe including some of the parents. And then, what in the world do you do with this mob? And to do it with little or no help, they say it's just one of the most remarkable feats of optimism and idealism that I can think of.
The state of Michigan in 1871 enacted legislation that required children between the ages of 8 and 14 to attend school 12 weeks of the year. And county superintendents of education were given almost total control of this new educational structure. They decided who would be hired and fired, how much a teacher would be paid, and what non-teaching duties were required.
The teachers were hired because they were available. They appeared to be moral, ethical young people, men or women, and they were available and would work for whatever salary that local school district would offer, which maybe was $1 or less a day.
Nevertheless, as the population grew and the school year continued to be lengthened, there was no shortage of teachers.
Throughout this period of the late 19th, early 20th century, there were many changes into how the schools were organized, how the teachers were educated, how children were educated. But the thing that remained the same was the character of those who went into teaching, and I should say stayed into teaching and were successful, because these were people who cared about children. Teaching has always been a caring profession.
Major societal changes brought on by America's involvement in the Great War had a significant impact on education, and the suffrage movement prompted more activism by the renamed Michigan Education Association, primarily for adequate salaries sufficient to cover living expenses for 12 months, but also for a retirement plan that included a state contribution. The association pushed hard for increased state support for education, even suggesting a dramatic trade-off: less money for roads, more money for schools. Teacher tenure also became a priority because teachers' rights were frequently ignored by superintendents and their school boards acting within the law of that time. By the time the stock market crashed in the fall of 1929, the association had more than 30,000 members and a new status as a serious force in Michigan educational affairs. A new headquarters with a small full-time staff was opened in Lansing, only a few blocks from the capital. Although school superintendents continued to control the organization, a Department of Classroom Teachers was organized within MEA in 1943 and immediately began a push for improved working conditions. Shortly after World War II ended, the MEA got involved for the first time in a major political campaign, a campaign to direct money from the sales tax for public education.
This was to earmark 1 cent of the 3-cent sales tax at that time for public schools and local units of government. And I think the first year after it passed, that meant an additional $47 million for education in the state. But the campaign was absolutely the first time I think MEA got its feet into the total political public relations effort.
As MEA turned 100 years old in 1952, the nation was deep into the Cold War. In that same year, World War II hero Dwight D. Eisenhower was elected to lead the United States through the dangerous years of nuclear confrontation with the Soviet Union. Under Ike's leadership, the nation experienced unprecedented economic growth. But for teachers, the good life remained elusive.
We went to the Upper Peninsula at Menominee, taught the 6th grade for $2,700, and there were 7 teachers and a janitor and myself. We had a teaching principal. It was an enjoyable year. I loved the kids. It was 24 children there, and it was a pleasant life, and I enjoyed teaching a great deal. However, at the end of the year, being single, I realized that I had wound up $50 in debt. And I said, oh my goodness, what have I done? I'm either going to have to get out of education, become a school administrator, or do something about this situation.
John Kennedy won the White House in 1961, but his promise of a new frontier did not include improved conditions for teachers.
I think there was a deep undercurrent, a deep wellspring of resentment and hurt feelings and frustrations and disappointments. It was like a giant festering sore.
Many frustrated teachers looked to the MEA as their only way to change the system.
The organization offered us a road for change, even small as it was and perhaps inconsistent as it was, but there was a mechanism and a pipeline, so to speak, whereby you could talk to somebody and you could bring your concerns to your Teachers Club representative and ask them if they would bring that up at the committee. It was quite informal, and that was about the only way that there was, that you could do anything.
Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike that the torch has been passed.
In the activist 60s, more and more young teachers were needed in the profession to teach the baby boom generation, and they were not content to accept the way things were. Their first goal was job security. Unprotected by tenure, teachers could be fired on any pretext.
Oh, teachers were fired for any kind of crazy reason. Teachers were fired for buying shoes in the wrong store in the wrong district. Teachers were fired for having their lights on after midnight. The principals would go down the street and see that teacher A had her lights still on after midnight, got written up, and it could be a basis for being fired.
In October of 1963, teachers took to the streets with their petitions, calling on the legislature to enact a tenure law. 8 weeks later, the MEA had gathered more than 300,000 signatures. The House and Senate quickly agreed to enact tenure legislation. But this was just the beginning of a revolution in education. Terry Herndon became a part of it when he made a change in his career plans and decided to become a teacher.
I was planning my life around the fact that I was going to work in a certain school, and I found out that that commitment was worthless, and thought was being given to assigning me elsewhere, and so I essentially resigned from that contract before it started. I moved on to Warren. And in Warren, I found the same kind of shenanigans. It was just an absolutely outrageous situation, and it's not one that I could easily tolerate, and it turned me into an activist.
In 1964, Lyndon Johnson's landslide victory altered the political landscape in America and had dramatic repercussions for the educational system in Michigan.
15 to 20 teachers were elected. Jerry Dunn, whom I knew was an old friend who taught in a district nearby, became the chairman of the Senate Education Committee, and I became the vice chairman of the House Education Committee. So teachers got together immediately and says, let's do something about the sorry situation that exists for teachers in this state.
While the MEA lobbied the new legislature for laws to authorize professional negotiations, union forces were pushing for collective bargaining rights for all public employees.
And Dale Kennedy, I think, to his lasting credit, provided the leadership to cause the MEA to support this bill that they for so long had resisted and they thought was destructive of their paradigm of the profession. But Dale had the insight to know what the future looked like and what had to happen. And I think most importantly, the consequences of nothing happening were just not acceptable to him.
Only a few months into the 1965-66 legislative session, the Public Employee Relations Act, PERA, was on the governor's desk. On July 23, 1965, George Romney signed the legislation. A new era in public education had begun.
And out of that, of course, was the ability of teachers to meet and organize and negotiate. Calendar, starting of the school year, classroom size, something to do with your salary, because then you could look at the books. What could a district afford? So it became a whole new ballgame. Some 30 years after the UAW and others got the right to negotiate, teachers finally got that right.
Attorneys Irwin Ellman and Ted Swift played major roles in PERA's implementation.
This law then immediately says all public employees have a right to organize. I mean, that's a Magna Carta to them. organize and collectively bargain. And the board, or whoever it is, will bargain, must bargain. You know, bingo. I mean, we've gone from nowhere to king of the mountain, or an equal.
With para a fact of life, MEA had to decide quickly on a strategy that would organize local chapters into bargaining units in more than 500 districts around the state. When that was accomplished, each unit would have to decide on what it wanted in the contract.
They knew they were unhappy. They sure as hell knew they were underpaid. They didn't know anything about a grievance procedure, arbitration, a way to resolve these smoldering disputes that existed in so many school districts.
Model contracts were developed by MEA for perplexed teachers, and in a handful of key districts, MEA staff quickly won favorable agreements. The majority of districts across the state were able to follow suit. Soon, most teachers had a real voice in educational affairs.
You saw teachers now having input into education. Who better than teachers ought to have some input into education, into curriculum, into class size, into the whole area of education. So you saw a different morale, and I think you saw education improve. I know you saw education improve as a result.
Strikes by public employees were prohibited by the para legislation, but MEA adopted a strategy in stubborn districts of no contract, no work. MEA lawyers argued that a public employee could not be on strike if a contract had not been signed with the employer.
As this strategy of no contract, no work, and we had it on every sign, you know, it was a good catchy slogan, began to catch on, the fall around Michigan was always, you know, really kind of dramatic. River Rouge is out, Ann Arbor's out. You know, Romney, good Governor Romney, sitting up there with this law that he thought would be a panacea of a lot of problems, suddenly is getting a lot of pressure from the public, and they're furious, and they're Romney. They're after Romney.
But the governor could not change things. In the fall of 1967, intransigent school districts looked to the courts for help in combating the MEA's no-work strategy. The issue became the use of court injunctions by districts to force teachers back into the classroom. The legal battle began in Holland.
I think Holland was a calculated decision by that school district as well as the Michigan Association of School Boards to say there's got to be a line drawn here somewhere.
The legal confrontation moved quickly from the local court to the state Supreme Court. The justices were badly divided, but the majority decision halted the practice of lower courts issuing injunctions that forced teachers back to work without school board proof of irreparable damage or breach of peace.
So they, in effect, amended the statute. It's still illegal to strike, but you better show grounds for why you should get an injunction. And that's the legacy, I guess, of Holland.
The Holland decision prompted a new tranquility on the educational scene. A few strikes still made headlines each fall, but the vast majority of teachers were under contract and happily in their classrooms. The battles to win basic rights in the workplace, a decent salary, and essential benefits were not the only battles faced by MEA in the 1960s. Civil rights was a burning issue in American life, especially following the destructive Detroit riots in 1967. The crisis in America had its impact on education. Although proud of its human rights record, the MEA in many ways reflected the divisions so apparent in American society. In early 1968, MEA and the Justice Department co-hosted a conference at MEA's St. Mary's Lake Camp on civil rights and education. Participants represented the establishment and the inner city, but the anticipated dialogue did not take place.
And as the conference began, somebody decided they didn't want to hear that agenda. There was a whole lot of bull. And so we're going to do something else with you people. The first thing we're going to do is take over this conference room and the center if necessary.
Chaos took control of the agenda, and the meaning of black power was made clear to the MEA.
The conference that never ended culminated with a large group of black educators, many of whom were not even members of the MEA, convening on their state representative assembly, sitting in the balcony watching them as they proceeded to consider a budget that was designed to provide $150,000 in program monies to implement a program that dealt with multicultural curriculum, non-sexist curricula and resources in our schools, a need to train people to reduce the incidence of violence in our high schools, to look at legislative reforms that need to be considered that equalized or help equalize access to quality, and to organize and politicize minority educators throughout the state to acquire the skills necessary to be effective participants inside the MEA.
The representative assembly that considered the demands of the St. Mary's Lake Conference was interrupted by news from Memphis that Martin Luther King had been murdered. In the charged atmosphere that followed, the assembly passed historic measures that would implement much of its minority caucus's agenda. When E. Dale Kennedy retired as MEA's executive secretary in 1970, the board of directors selected Terry Herndon, a young teacher activist, to replace him.
He was a young Turk. He was a pusher, he was a visionary, and we felt that that's what we needed. That said nothing against the people who we had, but we decided that we had to go in a new direction and that he could take us that way.
Herndon decided to change things quickly and dramatically by setting up a unified service, UniServe, promising members professional assistance on all issues from a network of local offices. A massive staffing effort, increasing the field staff from 19 to 88, created a more aggressive, more effective organization by the end of 1970.
Dues had moved from something like $25 a year to nearly $200 a year in a very short time. And people were astounded across the nation. Why were teacher associations, why were your dues suddenly jumping? And of course the reason was the teachers just loved what we were doing for them. They wanted more of it, they liked it, and they were willing to pay.
As the 1970s began, some districts decided to play hardball in dealing with their well-organized teachers. One of these districts was in the small Saginaw Valley farming community of Reese.
And the answer was no on all the proposals. This continued throughout the summer of 1970 and on into the beginning of the school year. We went to mediation, nothing. Mediator gave up, I'm going to send you to fact-finding. We applied for fact-finding, and he recommended a compromise salary increase. Board says no. We said we'll accept the fact-finding report. We wanted to settle. We did not want to go on strike.
But the superintendent and the school board were not prepared to compromise.
I got up and said, all those teachers that will not go back unless we have a contract, come with me. And we all marched to the front of the room in front of the whole community. So we had 44 teachers standing facing the community in that community room. And there was a stunned silence. I was scared. So were they. But we did it.
The Reese 44, virtually the entire faculty went out, and the board promptly fired them. In a few days, the district began hiring replacements. The action divided the community and almost led to violence. When the school year ended, the strike came to an end. Most of the Reese 44 never returned to their classrooms. 2 years later, in Dearborn Heights, Crestwood teachers reached a similar impasse with another uncompromising board. Another community was bitterly divided by the inability of teachers and administrators to find common ground on essential contractual issues. Prolonged strikes that could not be settled caused many people to question teacher activism. But within MEA, Reese and Crestwood demonstrated teacher commitment to the fight for dignity.
I was the equal of the superintendent when it came to enforcing the contract and talking about teachers' rights and privileges under the contract, that we were equally concerned. I was no longer an employee where he was my boss. I was equal to him across the table.
Early in the 1970s, MEA activism moved into the state political arena.
By the time I got to the MEA, teachers were generally agreed that politics were probably important and public policy was important, but it was imperative that this be nonpartisan. And it wasn't bipartisan, it was nonpartisan. That is, don't participate in a party, you just participate in the system. And that was so antithetical to the reality of American politics that it was pointless. And so I started preaching the gospel of bipartisan political participation. And so we created the Michigan EA PAC, and we did it on a two-caucus basis. There's a Republican caucus and a Democratic caucus. And the real call was for everybody to be involved in on their own terms.
In its first major statewide political battle of the new era, MEA fought a well-financed plan to provide state aid to private and parochial schools, so-called parochiaid, with a constitutional initiative to ban such aid. MEA's amendment won the battle and the respect of the state's politicians. The 1970s also saw MEA responding to other political issues that reshaped the organization.
I announced that this was the year of the females, and we began employing more women, and we put together affirmative action policies that dealt not only with minorities but with women. And if you look now, there are many women in management roles, many women in lower staff roles. It was very, very important for us. And I think it was important not only for what we were doing for those women, but we were telling our membership that women were important and women ought to be involved in this organization.
Herman Coleman became MEA's executive director in 1973 when Terry Herndon took over leadership of the National Education Association.
The organization became comfortable with the notion that skin color and sex had very little to do with one's competence. I think in many respects, the way the organization was allowed to grow in that regard made it possible for them to hire a female executive director when I left.
Beverly Woolco became MEA's executive director in 1979. During Woolco's tenure, significant changes took place within the MEA, including a major expansion of the membership. In 1978, educational support personnel were organized by MEA. In 1984, this group, representing secretaries, maintenance workers, food service employees, bus drivers, and others, was merged with MEA.
There was a definite caste system to the educational community. And once we joined MEA, management looked at us a lot different. We had more respect. We had more clout. And our style of living, our quality of life improved a great deal, not just monetarily, but it's also improved the way people looked at us, the respect that we gained. It was the best thing we ever did in the world.
MEA's clout prompted many college faculties to seek the association's assistance in their relations with the legislature and their boards.
At that time, there was a belief in the Michigan legislature that college professors at both the 2- and 4-year level were overpaid, underworked, and there was a real need to define what our workload was. Additionally, as we were working in our local colleges, we felt under threat from our administrations in the collective bargaining arena, and we saw a need for some help from some organizations. When we looked around, the organization that could give us the help at the legislature and with the governor's office was the MEA.
MEA members had always looked to their organization for assistance in gaining a decent salary. After PARA's passage, members looked to MEA to provide hard-won benefits as well.
When I started teaching, you didn't get any benefits except the state retirement program. If you wanted health insurance, you paid for health insurance yourself. There weren't well-defined groups, and groups had to be built. MESA was doing that before collective bargaining, so that when collective bargaining came in 1965, the MEA was ready to market group insurance to all kinds of school districts across this state who had never had anything of that nature.
Over the years, MEA's bargaining for an appropriate benefit package has led to comprehensive MESA coverage for thousands of members and their families. The average benefit package today costs approximately $6,500 in most cases, usually paid 100% by the school employer. As the 1970s drew to a close, Michigan's economic difficulties continued. An ailing automotive industry, skyrocketing inflation, interest rates, and unemployment. Thousands of teachers were being laid off due to funding shortfalls. Despite these difficulties and a major change in national politics, MEA retained its political clout. The 1982 state vote saw Jim Blanchard elected governor, and other friends of public education winning the majority of federal and state legislative seats. The Michigan economy improved in the early years of the Blanchard administration, and state support for public education increased. In 1990, however, the political landscape shifted dramatically.
In the 1990s, we had elected to the legislature some people that really didn't support public education and public employees. And they felt that their agenda was to remove some things that previous legislators had passed in the 70s and 80s. And they did. They went in and changed the Bargaining Act and said that you no longer can negotiate for a number of things. We're not going to let you do that anymore.
The 1995-96 legislative session saw a package of bills enacted that challenged many of the gains of past decades and restricted how MEA operated in the political arena.
I think that many of the battles are going to have to be fought over and over because those who oppose public education or oppose public educational employees will not go away when they have lost. They will continue to make those attacks. But it's important that members know the basis for what it is we're doing and what it is that brought us to where we are so that they can fight successfully those continued attacks.
Everywhere you go, if you commit tonight that we're going to turn out of this Capitol the opponents of public education, if you go, we'll win the fight.
Guidance counselor and new MEA member Lisa Miller understands that she has entered her profession at a critical time.
I can't lie. The salary, the health benefits, the working conditions are important. I think we take those for granted. I think a lot of younger people, new people to the organization might take that for granted. And I've heard some new teachers say, well, I want to bargain my own contract because I can get more money because I am a good person and I'm a good teacher, I'm a good counselor. And as an individual, I feel I could do better. But I think maintaining that unity, and that is all educators in Michigan working together for common goals, is very important.
Third-year teacher Buford Griffith quickly became active in his local unit and learned the important lessons of MEA's history.
I want to be a voice for that young person that's coming in straight out of college that really does not have a clue of what the organization is really all about, what the battles that they've gone through, the battles that they've fought and bled for and sweated for and picketed for. There's a lot of members out there, like myself, when I first became a member, that did not understand and did take for granted the salary, the benefits. I didn't understand and didn't realize the battles that these people went through. And I cherished the fact that those people went through that for me because they did that for me, whether they realize that or not.
One philosopher said very well that those who are not aware of the history are prone to repeat it. And I don't want our members to have to make the same mistakes over and over and over again. And so we're going to have a major challenge to make sure our members are educated. But in addition to that, we're going to have to commit ourselves as an organization to not be so tied to continuing everything we've always done simply because we've always done it, and we've done it well, to being willing to change when the members say they want change. That's a difficult thing to do.
Part of the changing landscape of MEA activities in the 1990s is a renewed commitment to professional development.
It's important for our members to understand that in addition to advocating for their economic benefits and rights, we can do other things. We're simply going to be refocusing to include more activities for them to enhance the teaching and learning environment. The PDI is one example. We offer conferences such as our IPD conference in the fall. We offer training seminars. We're going to be offering training for technology and the use of technology in enhancing the teaching and learning environment, and other opportunities for increasing their certification as a teacher in the classroom.
Despite all the challenges and battles that we've had and continue to have and will have, I don't believe that there's another profession in the world that is as important and valuable as what it is that the members of the MEA do, and that we're all going to be committed to do whatever is necessary to make sure that our members are successful so that our students can be successful, because I believe that the success of this democracy depends on the education of its people.